No trips, no concerts, no visits. Throughout the world, drastic measures are being imposed to combat the coronavirus. Millions must accustom themselves to an ongoing state of emergency. The European Union is hunkering down. Borders are closed for 30 days. Member states are checking passports again at what used to be open internal crossings. Every government seems to be thinking of its own people first, even as leaders rattle off appeals for cross-border solidarity. So how are people reacting? What consequences will the emergency measures have for our societies? Our topic today, Corona. How should we handle this crisis? Hello and welcome. This week's show is a bit different from usual. Our guests are exclusively colleagues from DW, because here, too, we're working under extraordinary new conditions, trying to counteract the spread of the coronavirus as far as possible. And that's why you also see us sitting much further apart than we're accustomed. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guests, beginning with Thomas Sparrow. He is a political correspondent here at DW, and he says, we need bold political decisions, but this is also a crucial time for personal solidarity. I'm also very glad to welcome Kate Ferguson. She's a colleague from DW Business, and she says leaders from the world of business and politics need to be guided by the principle of cooperation and not competition. And very glad to have with us as well Barbara Mohr. She reports for DW Sport, and she says it's not just about professional sports. With the closure of the many small sports clubs, an important social support in everyday life also breaks away for many people. So let me begin by asking all of you how you personally are coping, what the biggest challenges are that you're facing, and perhaps also what you're already missing. Thomas?
I think something that I'm particularly missing as a South American journalist and also South American citizen is probably hugs. We're very much used to shaking hands, to hugging people. And it has really been a challenge for me to try and keep this distance from other people and be conscious that this is very important at this time. So on a very personal level, I would say that is something that I'm particularly missing. I have obviously tried to stay at home as much as I can, to try and be much more aware of what's at stake. As I said, I think this is high time for solidarity, and I'm trying to also make sure that that's the case in my personal life, also at work, wherever I am. It's not only about being selfish and hoarding things, it's about really thinking about the other people as well.
Barbara?
I have two kids at home, 9 and 11 years old, and since Monday we're doing homeschooling with them, so that's of course a very new situation to us. Still, I think it's working okay so far, but I'm also living in a community with elderly people, with actually one child that has an immune disease, so I'm also very aware of me being responsible for not infecting anybody else.
Can you just tell me how you explain this to a child?
Luckily, my kids are old enough to reflect a bit on the situation, and then, of course, it does help to say, look, this neighbor, Elsa, she's older, and we really have to take care of her. We have to protect ourselves in order to protect her, and that makes it much easier if you have a concrete example, actually, to explain to the kids. Yeah.
Kate?
Well, like Thomas, I have a natural impulse to hug that I've only realised when I've been denied the opportunity. But something that I personally have been really struggling with is my own risk assessment. So over the past few weeks, as this crisis has been growing and we've seen the disaster unfold in other countries, I've been questioning all of my own decisions. Should I have met that person for coffee a few weeks ago? Should I be taking public transport? Should I be leaving the house at all? And it's something that I am continuously struggling with, because you're guided on one level by what leaders are telling you to do, but then you have your individual responsibility as well. So I had 2 trips that I cancelled this month, but it really took quite a lot of thinking for me to come to that decision.
Thomas, I know that you've just returned from Latin America. What was the situation there, and how were people there reacting?
There are fewer cases in South America than what we're seeing here in Europe, especially in some of European countries that are very badly affected by all this. So in South America, the situation is only just starting. But it has meant that political leaders are taking decisions very early. So in particular in Colombia, where I was, borders have been already closed. People have been told to stay at home. It is very difficult for Colombians to actually stay at home, in particular for those who actually need to go out to work, who probably haven't got that safety net that you have in other parts of the world. So it is a very difficult situation. You go to supermarkets and they are also empty. That's something that I've been seeing from my own family. When they go and buy things, that's very difficult for them to get what they want. So South America is a bit behind compared to Europe, and there is a lot of concern that maybe South America will see in a few weeks what Europe is seeing right now. And that's why you also see political decisions. You can be critical of them, you can support them, but there are political decisions trying to minimize the impact of the coronavirus.
It's been said that Europe and the US didn't use the time after China started to wrestle with corona, that they did not use their window of opportunity. Do you think Latin America is doing so?
And that is the absolute key element there. When you look at what's being debated in Latin America, it's exactly that, saying we need to be able to act now. So not when we have hundreds of cases, but when we have only a few cases. If you see, for example, the case of El Salvador, they closed the borders when they had 0 cases because they said, we're not giving this a chance. We're not going to wait until we have 100 to start making decisions. And what you hear from many people in Latin America and also in Colombia in particular is it has to be done before the situation gets very bad. You can't simply wait for a long time.
Barbara, even after concerts and trade fairs had long since been cancelled, major soccer games in the Bundesliga and also in the Champions League were still being played in front of tens of thousands of fans. That is now over. What does that mean for football fans in Germany, including yourself?
Yeah, I think this was actually a crucial point where many people finally understood that something serious is happening, because never before would just like bigger leagues all over the world suddenly shut down, and even now the Euros being postponed. This is obviously a big thing. So I think this is more like an alarm for everybody, saying now we really have this situation and we have to act. But of course it's difficult for the fans, not only that teams aren't playing, that the league's not playing, but also for those being active themselves, because also the smaller clubs are shut down and you can't go to your fencing club, to your gym class, whatever, but you have to be creative and stay at home.
Just one thing I'd like to add there, because I am also a sports fan, and what I realized when all these events started to get cancelled is that this is above all a challenge that is not only for politicians, not only for world leaders, it is something that it's absolutely up to us as well to make sure that this doesn't spread any further. And when you see that clearly with sports, when you have all these events being cancelled, when you're being told you really have to make your own, you have to participate in a way that you reduce the impact of this virus, that's something that I particularly saw when you have events cancelled, concerts, theatres, but also in particular sports, which is something very important for many people around the world.
Yes. Kate, when it comes to wake-up calls, we're certainly getting one from the stock markets as well. They are absolutely setting records as they plummet. What do you think is in store for us, and what's your personal feeling as you watch these curves just fall and fall and fall?
Well, I think if there's one tiny good thing to come of this crisis, it's that the myth of our own invulnerability has been completely exposed, both on an individual and on a global level. And when it comes to the stock market, we haven't seen as much volatility since the Great Depression. But I also think it's important to separate what's happening on the stock market with the experience of everyday people. Stocks always go up and down. They're likely to continue to be volatile for as long as we have this crisis, because this is a public health issue. So it's completely unpredictable. But I think it's very important for governments to act quickly and decisively to shore up people's lives and make sure their jobs are secure. And Germany so far has actually done quite a good job of that by implementing some policies so that if a company wants to let somebody go because of the coronavirus, instead of actually firing them, they will keep them on the books but continue to give them some pay.
And I want to come back to that a little bit later on in the show. But first of all, I'd like to take a look at how some people living under lockdown, which we don't have yet here in Germany, but we may eventually, how some are proving especially creative at dispelling fear and loneliness.
Fighting isolation by making music together. Through the days of quarantine, they give each other courage, as here in Rome. An Italian quartet gives a free open-air concert, not to a live audience, but rather live on Facebook. And the Berlin Philharmonic played Berio and Bartók to an empty house. Music lovers were able to live stream the concert into their living rooms. How much do we really need to be together?
Thomas, we saw in the first sequence from Italy, people out there on their balconies, and not only there are balconies playing a big role in Italy. In Spain, people are apparently doing fitness on their balconies with a trainer on a rooftop instructing them. Do you think things like that we saw, things like what we saw in the report, are just temporary distractions, or do they actually help to build that sense of solidarity that you were talking about earlier?
I absolutely think that they help to build that sense of solidarity. I think, in times of crisis around the world, you can have the worst out of people, but you can also get the best out of people. And these examples that we're just seeing here are how people are being very creative to try and make sure that this very difficult, very bad situation for many people can be at least a little bit improved in many different ways. This is something that you also see in other parts of the world, by the way. This is also that you're also starting to see right here in Germany. I saw something very interesting in recent days of people asking to buy vouchers of their favorite restaurants that they can then redeem later on when the crisis has been overcome. I thought that was a fantastic idea to try and help your favorite restaurant or your favorite supermarket or your favorite shop. They can obviously not sell things now as they would before, but that's a way in which you can help. So I definitely think it's high time for solidarity.
Great, thank you. Barbara, in your opening statement, you said that the cessation of sporting events would deprive many people of a very important social support that they need in a time like this. So is there any substitute for that in the virtual world, and how are sports fans coping?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on now. Like, of course, with social media, there's another way to connect than, again, virtually. This is, we have seen that in China already, people having challenges through their WeChats groups who can do more sit-ups and groups sitting together, or even having a drink together, just virtually being connected. And there's actually also a lot on the market. Like, there is a program for bike riders. You can actually sit in the basement on your bike, on a fixed bike, and be virtually connected, and actually at the moment live being riding against other cyclists sitting in their basement and doing the same. So I think a lot of these kind of alternatives are going to come up now, and will hopefully do some substitution.
Kate, you said in your opening statement that we need political decisions that are very much based on cooperation. Do you feel like we're seeing that adequately, and are people paying attention? I have to say, I live in Kreuzberg, one of the central districts in the city. Frankly, at least until today, people there have not really fully been adhering to the new rules. Just yesterday, I saw about 25 young men playing a game of pickup soccer in a local park, very close together, definitely not social distancing, very sweaty. Do you think people have gotten the message?
Well, sadly, I've seen similar scenes, on the way here, for example. But what I think is really important for us as journalists to do is to frame social distancing as the ultimate act of solidarity that it is. So if one of us here at the table were to become infected without social distancing, within a month, 244 people would be infected as a result. With social distancing, we can reduce that to 4. And that message really needs to come across. So it is really great that we're seeing these examples of community spirit. That's really heartening. But actually, the best thing you can do to save lives is to stay away from people. And we really need to hammer that home.
Can I say something just to that?
You can, but can you say it in response to an additional question I'd just like to tack on to that, namely in regard to the Chancellor's appeal?
It was exactly that what I was going to say.
Because the Chancellor gave exactly that message. And she gave it in language such as I have never heard her use before. Very personal, very urgent. It was the first time she's addressed the German nation in this form since she has taken power, and she's been in power a long time. Do you think that message is going to be heard? Will it get through to those people who need to hear it, those young men playing soccer in my park?
Melinda, that was exactly what I was planning to talk about, that speech by Angela Merkel yesterday, that address on national television. She normally does those addresses only on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, and this is the the very first time in her 15 years as Chancellor that she gives such an address on television, and that just gives you an idea of how urgent it is and how important it is that decisions are not only made right at the top, but that people understand what you're just saying, Kate, that this has to be done by all of us. And I agree with you totally that Angela Merkel's message yesterday was very clear, it was human, it was authoritative, it was very clear, and I do hope that people here in Germany will understand that it's time for them to act, that it's not time for them to keep playing football outdoors or taking their kids to the playground. It's really time for all of us to understand that this is a very big responsibility that we have.
And when it comes to those playing in the park, we can hope that if not Angela Merkel, also the head coach of the national football team, of Germany's national football team, has had a speech yesterday going to the same direction. So maybe those still playing football in the parks then would listen to him at least and also follow the rules.
On the other hand, Kate, we at the same time are seeing shortages of things like toilet paper as people essentially engage in hoarding behavior. And even more serious is stockpiling of very important medical goods, including breathing masks and hand sanitizer, price gouging by some people who've bought up tens of thousands of bottles of hand sanitizer. What does that tell us about how people are reacting to this crisis? And do you think we'll see more of it as things get worse?
Well, as Thomas said earlier, we're seeing the very best and the very worst of humanity come out of a crisis, which is to be expected. Here in Germany, we have a wonderful word to describe this sort of panic-buying Hamsterkauf, which a colleague of mine is appealing for us to install into the English language, like the word
hamstering.
Hamstering, squirreling things away. And yeah, we have seen a lot of that. But in that address last night, Angela Merkel really did reassure people that supermarkets would be stocked and that really a bigger issue for supply is actually people panic buying. The logistics chains are solid at the moment, and those cargo trucks are not being stopped at borders. So we don't really need to have to worry about that.
Speaking of borders, let us dive a little bit deeper into the subject of shortages and the economic effects of this crisis. At the beginning of the week, Germany largely shut down its borders with France, Denmark, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Austria. Officials claim that the movement of goods won't be affected, but reality tells a different story.
Border checks are once again backing up traffic, as here on Germany's border to France. A microscopic virus is bringing Europe to its knees. The Union is isolating itself. The only ones allowed in are those who work here or need to stock up on necessities like medications. Only trucks are allowed through without checks, but traffic is backing up at border crossings, like here in Kufstein. That in itself may lead to considerable disruption to supply chains. For now, we see no cause for worry, but everyone should act responsibly and take only what they really need. Rest assured that everything is being done to guarantee adequate supplies. Yet, even before borders were closed, supermarket shelves were emptied all across Europe, as here in Britain. And shortages of medicines are expected over the coming weeks. This is the downside of globalization. It has many upsides, but these are the classic downsides. Can our basic needs be covered?
Thomas, let me address that question to you. Can our basic needs be covered? And also, in regard to the border closures, even the Chief of Staff of the Commission President of the European Union has said border closures aren't going to do a whole lot because the virus is long since here in the individual member countries of the European Union. So
I agree with that.
What's going on with these border closures, and will they imperil supply?
Well, the hope is that it won't imperil supply, and there are guidelines already in place to make sure that essential goods, like medicine, for example, or food, can indeed reach those who need it the most. I do agree that border closures may not have a very big effect, but at the same time, the goal of all these measures, including border controls, is to slow down the process of the coronavirus. Make sure that, well, you've probably seen that flattening the curve idea, making sure that you spread it as much as possible so that all health services at a national level, but also at a European level, can cope with this. And maybe in this specific point, those border closures may have an impact. Not a very big impact, not an impact on their own, but they can help to have an impact. I do believe that.
Kate, VW and Daimler, two of Germany's biggest car companies, VW, in fact, biggest car company in the world, are stopping production for now. Is Germany and perhaps the world as a whole about to slide into the worst recession that we've seen since the Great Depression of the 30s? And you mentioned it in the outset. Is Germany, with its so-called social market economy, pretty well equipped to handle this, if that is in fact what occurs?
Yeah, we most likely are going to head into a severe recession, but it's what happens after that. So economists hope that there'll be what's called a V-shaped recovery, so a very steep decline, but then when this virus is under control, that things will improve very quickly again. But in order for that to happen, you need policies in place. And so what's happened here in Germany is a number of measures have been introduced to ensure that things will continue smoothly. So one of them, as you mentioned, was this Kurzarbeit. This is a benefit that...
Short work,
yes. This is a benefit that applies to people who would otherwise lose their jobs because of, in this case, the coronavirus. Instead of being fired, they keep their jobs on the books. They no longer work because they're not needed, but they get 60% of their salary paid for by the government. And that is something which typically works very well in crisis situations, because it means that when the crisis is over, things can continue seamlessly. They've also introduced tax deferrals for companies struggling, and they are also offering unlimited loans. So they are doing a lot to ensure that the recovery is as smooth as possible.
Thomas, if we look at the situation in Europe as a whole, we could be forgiven for concluding that the European Union is this only in name. We've seen very little solidarity in terms of support for either the suffering people or economies of Spain, of Italy. Is Brussels finally now waking up?
A bit too late, but they are waking up. What you saw at the beginning was basically all the countries mostly affected dealing on their own, basically trying to solve the situation on their own, asking for Brussels for help. And that's why now, for example, you see Chancellor Angela Merkel, among other European leaders, try to stress the fact that they are working together to find solutions. I agree that that's absolutely necessary, but I do also think that that came a bit too late, that help should have been there much earlier when the crisis was not as bad, and not now when you have thousands of cases in many different European countries.
Barbara, football also losing millions in foregone income, particularly problematic for the smaller soccer clubs. Is there any help for them? And what will be the consequences of postponing these really important matches like the European Football Championship?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we have to keep in mind that only like 3 to 4% of all the football players worldwide earn as much as the public thinks they do. So for many, it's actually a very, very fragile situation, especially players in Latin America or in Africa, where contracts are not as secure as they are in Bundesliga. For German clubs, actually, the first have already asked for Kurzarbeit. The first third league clubs in Germany they can use the same measures as other companies here in Germany. But then it's as I said, it's very different worldwide, and I'm afraid for smaller clubs and also for women's football, for example, that has been on the rise recently. Finally, numbers growing, but structures are extremely fragile. So I'm afraid they're gonna have to take some steps back and start forward.
We're slowly coming to the end of our discussion, so I'd like to take us back to something all of you have said. You've said in a crisis like this, we can see both the best and the worst of people. What do you think will come out in the end? Our title asks how we're handling the crisis. Do you think, as it's so often said, in this crisis we might find an opportunity to perhaps change track? Or would you expect that we may see selfishness prevail in the end? Kate?
There'll be examples of both, I have no doubt. But I do think that now, for any countries perhaps that have no coronavirus cases yet, or very few, this is an opportunity to learn from the experience of others, and that has to be the priority.
We've seen many medical systems struggling because they've been underfunded for decades. Do you think that'll change after this?
I can only hope that political pressure increases. You know, we have the huge case of so many Americans who are uninsured, and their status in this crisis is uncertain. So you would hope that there would be a drive for change. So we can only wait and see.
Barbara?
I think those people believing in solidarity, they just have to be louder and more present to encourage everybody else to support each other.
Thomas?
I think in 10 or 15 years' time, when we look back at this, or at least that's my hope, we will look at those scenes from the balconies in Spain and Italy and think that that was a very good example, and that we also were able to learn from those acts of selfishness, because this will not be the last crisis where you will see the worst and the best of humanity.
The Chancellor said yesterday it's the worst crisis Germany has faced since the Second World War. I've sometimes wondered whether later we will see this as the kind of hiatus in history the Second World War was for many people. Thank you very much to all of us for being with us today, and I wish all of you the best of health, and I wish the same to you, dear viewers. We hope you stay healthy. We are going to be taking a break with To The Point for at least 4 weeks, and we hope to see you after that. Stay well.